The mainstream media and the Bank of Canada don't have a clue about what's going on with inflation, and I'm going to show you that in what we do today. So inflation risks fading. Remember that. Latest data has economists predicting multiple rate cuts by Bank of Canada. That doesn't surprise me, and I think that will happen. I think the Bank of Canada will continue cutting rates because they don't have a clue. I mean, needless to say, at any point in time, do they ever have a clue what they're saying, what they're talking about? No, they don't. So I don't think that's really going to change. But what's interesting is this: inflation risks fading. We'll get onto that. So stay tuned here. So this is from Statistics Canada. All the links in the description. Consumer Price Index rose 2.5% on a year-over-year basis in July, increasing at the slowest pace since March 2020 and down from a 2.7% gain in June 2024. So let's have a look at what went up and what went down. So, I mean, it doesn't really look like a lot of things really went down when you look at this chart, but basically you can see the year-over-year numbers are what are really dragging the Consumer Price Index down. You've still got shelter that is going up at 5.7%, but it is lower, and this drags down the numbers, making it look a lot lower than it is. But you don't have to go far into the numbers to see that inflation, the pace of inflation, has actually been rising a lot this year. And the Bank of Canada, like I said, they don't have a clue what they're talking about. Statistics Canada data are incredibly manipulated. We know that inflation is incredibly high in Canada. If you go to shadow stats, which I've used so many times on this channel, and this is on the US data, but it's very similar for Canada. You can see the CPI-U, which is what basically Statistics Canada reports, is down under 5%. But if you look at what's happening with the 1980s based CPI, which guess what? They're not changing constantly. They're not meddling with all the time. You can see it's above 10%. In fact, it's between 10 and 15%, which most of you would probably agree is actually way more accurate. So the government obviously always wants you to think inflation is a lot lower than it actually is. And they really ramped up manipulating the CPI in the 1990s, funnily enough, when the Bank of Canada and the Fed started targeting inflation, because believe it or not, they didn't have a target for inflation before that. So anyway, you've got food that's up, shelter that's up. The only things that are really down in this chart is household operations, furnishings, and equipment, probably led lower by the housing bubble imploding. Although it is surprising considering the population growth, because they still need furniture and different things like that. Clothing and footwear down. Again, these aren't necessities, but transportation and pretty much all the other necessities are going up. So this is disinflation. And I just want to highlight, this isn't deflation. It's just the pace of inflation is slowing. It's not actual deflation. You're not actually seeing prices that are falling. You're just seeing the rate of growth of prices that is falling. But interestingly enough, you look at prices for passenger vehicles, that declined sharply in July 2024. So this chart, unfortunately, only goes back to July 2023. So not much data there. But you can see that has gone down significantly. And obviously, you've got a good chunk of Ontario that is dependent on that industry. So that's worth noting here. So when you look at the year-over-year numbers, it looks very, very good, doesn't it? It looks like inflation is slowing down. It looks like the Bank of Canada is getting everything correct. But the funny thing is, when you go to a month-over-month basis and you just look at what's happened so far this year, it doesn't look so rosy. So far this year, we've had 1 month where we printed below 0%, where we actually had deflation in that month, and that was 0.1%, so barely anything. You started off in January 2024, 0%, 0.3, 0.6, 0.5, 0.6, 0.4, and then minus 0.1, you're at like 2.3%. So in just 2024, cumulatively, you're above the Bank of Canada's inflation target of 2%. It's important to look at what's going on month over month because it sets a trend of what's actually going on, because the year-over-year numbers are distorted by the fact that you have high numbers, very high numbers that you're coming off. So you have the base effects making the inflation look lower than it actually is. But like I said, when you look at the cumulative effect of inflation, this year so far has been pretty strong for inflation. Like I said, we're already at 2.3%, and you've only had 7 months of data reported. So you're already over the Bank of Canada's target for inflation, and you've you've got 7 months reported. So again, and I don't expect inflation to rise. I just want to make that clear because I think the economy is just being hammered so bad. It's in a depression, but then the government numbers are heavily manipulated. So it's fair to say, I think inflation's still going to be there, but I think inflation is going to be a lot lower than you saw in like 2021 and 2022, just because the economy and people struggling so bad. But obviously you've got also the high immigration that does impact inflation, especially when people can't find jobs. They're relying on government supports. All those supports are inflationary because they're not producing anything, all these new people into the economy. And then you look at what's happening with core inflation, which the Bank of Canada looks at, which obviously excludes all the essential items that people actually need. That's what's so hilarious about the core. But this is what they focus on. You've had 0.1, 0.1, 0.5, 0.2, 0.6, minus 0.1, and then you've just had 0.3. So when you look at these charts, it doesn't look like it's slowing down. You had 0.4, so nearly 0.5% printed for July, and then you had 0.3 for core. So you got 1.7% cumulatively on the core inflation now. So that means that 2024, if you look what's happened, you've had inflation that has been pretty strong, especially if you compare it to the latter half of last year. So I find that very, very interesting. Obviously, the Bank of Canada has cut 25 basis points and 25 basis points. You've got the mainstream media that is thinking, oh yeah, you know what, they're going to come in and cut more. I think that's definitely going to be the case. But I think they're way behind the curve here, and they don't have a clue what they're talking about, the Bank of Canada, or doing. Statistics Canada's July Consumer Price Index showed a significant cooling in inflation, with the rate easing to 2.5%, its slowest pace since March of 2021. Again, when you read these headlines, it sets a narrative where people would think, oh my God, yeah, inflation is getting really low. But they don't actually realize for most of 2024, it's actually been incredibly strong. I just don't get it, guys, because it's so easy to see. I mean, I'm not the smartest guy or the smartest tool in the toolbox, but I can see this. And these senior economists, they act like they can't see this. I mean, surely they're seeing this. And again, this just blows apart the Bank of Canada's credibility, which in my opinion was blown apart anyway when they did the massive amount of monetizing the government's deficits. But anyway, when you look at the banking system, when you look at what's going on, when you look at the Bank of Canada and they're saying inflation is our top priority. Yeah, but you can't see the month-over-month data. They're going through this, guys. They're all talk. They just yap a lot. They don't have a clue what they're saying, or they do know what they're saying. They're just not telling you the truth. They're just jawboning. And that's why you have channels like mine here to tell you the truth of what's going on here. And guys, you've still got the repo rate, the volume, which is extremely high, which is signaling distress. You can actually look at what's happened here and you can see how these lines are very straight. There's not much going on there. But if you look at what happened since interest rates got high, the market's all over the place in terms of this rate. It's not very stable, and it may only be moving a tiny bit, but that's a sign that the Bank of Canada is having to constantly intervene in order to keep that overnight rate where it's got its base rate set at. Because otherwise, if it wasn't doing that, you would just have it skyrocket, because the actual thing is the risk within the banking system, the lending is actually skyrocketing. So these central banks, they do things that distort the market. If it wasn't for the central bank, interest rates would have gone way higher than 5% as a result of people not wanting to lend and becoming more risk off, in particular, chartered banks and financial institutions that are operating in this repo market. And we've already had things like Laurentian Bank reporting a massive loss. And I'm sure they're not going to be the only one that is reporting problems that sort of look very suspicious. And I mean, $117.5 million loss is not suspicious. That is outright terrible. But you're beginning to see the cracks because this is actually a primary dealer in the repo market. So they could be one of the banks, I don't know for sure, we'll never know for sure, but they could be one of the banks that has been destabilizing the repo market and forcing the Bank of Canada to introduce more liquidity. So it's not a good sign when you have all these things going on. You're being lied to by all the central planners as usual, telling you inflation is coming going down, and it's a great achievement, and the economy is just booming, running on all cylinders. It's just a total joke to believe that. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, I'd highly recommend that you check out this video here. And if you're looking for a VPN to protect your privacy, you know where to go. Go into the description, expressvpn.com/marketmania. That's the VPN that I use, affiliate link down there. I will see you guys in the next